this morning I want to talk about what is relational coordination and how does it help people work better together and how does it improve performance. I'll give some examples from airlines, healthcare, and long-term care, elder care. So this is where I started to see relational coordination. And maybe it was even earlier because as Karsten knows, I grew up on a farm. And so I grew up kind of in a business, you know, it's like growing up at work and seeing very much how people work together and finding it very interesting. But when I began to study it, it was looking at airlines and watching this. I was a student at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, doing my PhD in human resource management, industrial relations, and wanted to understand how frontline workers create value and how they drive the performance of their organizations. So really was looking at the front line, and what I saw was one way they create value is when they come together between their silos and they connect to coordinate their work. And I guess I kind of knew that, but it became really obvious how important it was to connect between the bubbles or between the silos to create value, because each one has so much knowledge, but it only becomes truly valuable when it connects with the other ones. So that was very interesting. And as the first airline I observed was American Airlines in the Boston airport. And when I went to headquarters in Dallas and talked to the executive vice president of operations, Bob Baker, he said, "This is the most complicated thing we do every day, you know, in many locations, many times a day, and most people here in headquarters don't realize that." And I thought, that's interesting. Now he did in part because he used to work on the ramp. He used to be a ramp agent, you know, and his father was a ramp agent. And that now he was the vice president of operations for the whole company, so he definitely knew what it was like to work there and how important it was and how challenging it was. But many leaders now at American are coming, they never worked on the front line. And so what it made me realize at the beginning was that this is very important work. It drives value for the organization, but it's very important that leaders know that and know how to support that. So that kind of gets us to one of our topics for today, which is leading relational coordination. To first of all, even have that be visible, be able to see that so that you know that how important it is to lead it well. But as I started to observe American Airlines, they told me about another airline that I had never heard of, Southwest. And Southwest was also in Dallas. It was had been around for a while, but people didn't know about it yet in my part of the country. And so I began to study them too. And I saw there were some very interesting differences in this kind of coordination. In both airlines, people knew their own jobs very well, but at Southwest, they also knew each other's jobs. Not that I can go do your job, but I understand and respect and see how it connects to my job and how important it is and how ultimately I share your goals and you share my goals. So people would say, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? Well, we're trying to get you there on time with your bags safely and happy and to do it efficiently. So regardless of the job, people had kind of the same, they were sharing each other's goals. And at American, it's like, this is my job. Boom, that's it. This is what I do, this is what I know. And there were differences in the status and the respect. And it was hard to communicate in a timely way because people didn't really know who needed to know what and why and when. So you would follow the rules, but you wouldn't necessarily know what to do when there wasn't much time. So what I started to think after observing these two airlines and interviewing many people was that relationships were actually shaping the communication through which coordination was happening. So coordination was not this mechanical process. It really was highly relational, and not relational in the sense that, oh, you know, Tom and Betty have to both be working together for the flight departure to work. You can't know every individual. In fact, the respect, when I first really understood respect, I was talking to a Southwest pilot, and I said, well, what do you guys mean by mutual respect? And he said, look, this is what I mean. This guy coming up from the ramp right now to give me this information, I don't even know him, but I respect him, and I know he respects me. And so it's not about who knows who, it's the respect for the role and the shared goals across the role. But so what I started to see was that that relationships are shaping the communication, and sometimes in this very positive way. We have shared goals. We may have our own individual goals, but we see how they're shared, and shared knowledge. So I know my job, you know your job, but we also know how they're connected, and mutual respect that comes from that. And that is driving sufficiently frequent, timely, accurate, and problem-solving communication, which helps then to reinforce the positive relationships. All right, well, the question I think is, what are some of the key insights about relational coordination? I think first, that it's really simple to understand what it is: shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect, working together with those kind of relationships. But even though it's easy to understand, it can be very hard to do. And one of the reasons is we've inherited organizations that don't make it very easy to do. So we need to change those relationships, but understand that part of that is changing the organizations too, so that they can help support that way of working together. So now we ask, well, what causes that? You know, what are those organizational structures? And the ones that we have identified that create stronger patterns of relational coordination, as I said, it starts with how we select people and then train them. And we had a conversation back here about, well, what is it about how we select people? What are we selecting for? And I used to say selecting for relational competence, not just the technical competence, but also the relational competence. Sometimes people call that selecting or hiring for teamwork. And that's either when you're selecting someone to first join your organization, or even when you're selecting people for promotion. What are we selecting for? What are we valuing? And is it just the technical, or is it the technical and relational competence that we're looking for? There's just one other thing to share about selection for now, and that is it's not even when you're selecting for teamwork. It's not just that you get a different person than you would get if you were not selecting for teamwork, but the same person that you might hire has a different expectation of why they're being hired and what your organization needs from them. Because when I learned this at Southwest, when they select people, they have many different methods of seeing what is this person really like to work with. And they talk a lot about what we expect from a Southwest employee. And so I think not only do they get a different kind of person, but the person who joins really understands already what is the culture here and what part of myself do I bring to work. Because we can all think about people, for example, who are wonderful community members and are contributing in a kind of a teamwork way to the local baseball team or to their church. But that's not who they bring to work, right? So it's not just who is the person we're selecting, but what is their understanding of why we selected, why are they coming here? Okay, so that's selection and training for teamwork. I'll just talk about a few others. And that is shared accountability and rewards. have a huge influence on how people, on this relational coordination. So one example is, even in a country like Denmark, where there's one entity, the government, paying for healthcare, still there are coordination challenges because everybody has a separate budget, right? There's one person, it's all paid for together, but it's all these different budgets, and each budget, and I hear this from people in the hospitals, especially when times get tough and we have to be more disciplined with our budgets, we get even worse coordination because we're only thinking about, we only can spend our resources on what we're doing, and you're spending on just what we're doing, and the patient falls right through the middle. That's something that's one of the reasons in Vardy we see the weak ties between the GPs and the hospitals and the municipalities. All these separate budgets mean we should just be looking at our own budget, and so we don't have the shared rewards for caring for that same patient. And so, the US, we have the same problems, worse. And when we look now for accountable care and creating a bundled payment means one payment for the whole patient from the beginning to the end of their care. And everybody in between has to figure out, how do we share that? And how do we work together so that we can do it with that one budget? So, and one of the solutions we'll see in Vardy was, maybe we need some shared budgets between these different groups, even within the municipality, that are trying to work with the same citizen, and we're not coordinating, but if we had a shared budget, maybe we would. So it turns out how we reward, how we share the costs and rewards are very, that either creates silos or it helps to connect between the silos. Even how we measure performance, even if it wasn't for the budgets, I'm being held accountable for these outcomes, you're held accountable for those outcomes, and maybe we're not coordinating because one example is an emergency department. The emergency department is responsible for getting people into the hospital bed quickly. That's one of the measures that everybody looks at. But the people who can really make that possible are in the hospital units, and that's not their measure. So they could help, but they're not helping because they're not being measured for how fast you get a patient into a bed. So it's how we measure and hold people accountable that often is creating the silos that we see. And then, for example, well, you can see how all of these things, we talk about shared information systems. Well, we create information systems that look like they're shared. Electronic health record, everybody can go in there. But as Karsten said, they're really designed to document and not really to coordinate. So people will go in and only look at what the other nurses have written, if they're a nurse. If they're a doctor, they'll go in and just read what the other doctors have written, maybe. And so, likewise, so the information system itself is not really shared. It's just in the same little silos that we had before. So when those structures are designed to connect across the silos, we have stronger relational coordination and better performance outcomes. So that's what we learned. And I think it's important, but it's not, basically the bottom line is that these structures can either weaken relational coordination or support it, but it depends on how they're designed and how we implement them. I think one other key insight is that even though it's invisible, it's really important for all kinds of outcomes. The well-being of citizens, the well-being of workers, how efficient are we, how much quality can we produce, all of those depend on something that's invisible, relational coordination. And notice what the very first thing is, and that's creating a safe space. And that's especially important, as we noted, when there's a lack of respect, because then it's hard to move into relational coordination if you're afraid of what other people are going to do to you or say to you. So some of my colleagues who work with psychological safety, like Ed Schein, and he says, if you could just figure out how to do that first thing, you're in good shape. Because in some places it might be easy. Like maybe in Denmark in general, it's a little easier because there is even if our organizations are hierarchical, there's a general culture of equality that might make it a little easier to work with this. And I guess the third key insight is that even though it's invisible, we can actually change it. If we can understand it and find ways to see it by measuring it, by drawing maps, relational maps, we can make the invisible visible to everybody, and that's something that we can work on together and change. So that you can't change just by changing your structures. You have to address somehow the relationships directly. And one of the ways to do it is to do this and say, oh, even make it visible. That is the beginning of a change. But here's what we're basically finding, that we need to do 3 kinds of interventions. One is, of course, the structural interventions, which we talked about, but it usually doesn't start there. It usually starts with a relational intervention. And I'll describe it in a moment, and not forgetting our engineering colleagues who can help to redesign the work. Because we could say, oh, the lean people are forgetting all about relationships. Well, the relationship people might forget all about the work. You know, you almost need the two together. And then it turns out that you do need to change the structures, because if you just change the relationships, you may have a new culture, but it won't last because all the structures are still telling you to do the old thing, right? So it's really not an either or, it's a both and. So I think those are the 3 key insights that I would have about relational coordination. Easy to understand, hard to do, invisible, but it matters a lot for performance. And if we can make it visible, we find ways to change it, and we can all change it together. But then the second question is, what do I see as the big potential for relational coordination going forward? I love that question. We can think, well, just make organizations perform better, do what we do better. But I think it's more than that. I think it's got the potential to be a culture change for not just the Danish culture, not just the US culture, but possibly the culture of human beings. We have gone through a period of the great rationality, of the Enlightenment, and a kind of mechanistic way of understanding the world. And some people say we're heading now into the age of relation, where we see how important it is that we understand ourselves as being in relation with each other, and in relation with people around the world, and even with the earth itself. And I think the potential is to create a different way of living together and working together that will be the new way for way beyond our own lifetime. So that's what I see as the potential. It's very hopeful, because we live in a time of also great violence, as people from very different points of view are being brought together by information and how easy it is. Cultures that used to be separate are now living together. So we're going through a period of violence, but if we come through that in a way that builds the relationships, I see the potential to create really a very wonderful outcome. And it will be us, it will be our children, but that's where I think we're headed. So it's you mentioned, how do we move into an age of relation when we are in a time of such violence across people who have very, very different points of view and very, very different cultures? And I think that's what I like about relational coordination. It's not about bringing people together who are the same, because that's already happens. It's about bringing people together who are different and creating something that's shared, a mutual respect, a shared goals, and a shared understanding across difference. And if we're going to move forward, that's exactly what we need to do, to see why the difference is, see what's good about it. We don't all want to be the same. It would not be a very interesting world, but that we all bring a different perspective, and that by seeing that and seeing the conflict and then making it a creative conflict to create something better than either one of the two perspectives alone, that's really our challenge. And to see, understand, and respect the difference, and not just be able to work with people who are like ourselves. That's the potential, and I think that's our challenge.